All right. Well, there's a famous saying by George Box, actually, the statistician, that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So hopefully there's an analog for public speaking that we can have today. Anyways, I want to talk about dynamic vegetation to be incorporated in AOGCMS. I work right on this intersection. I'm going to talk about some challenges for this class of models in the first part of my talk. And then in the second part of my talk, summarize a new approach, or a young approach that we have to try to meeting some of those challenges. And I'll end with some conclusions. The cross-cutting themes to that are going to be that in this group of models, we're still focusing a lot on the mechanisms behind vegetation dynamics, techniques for scaling. Vegetation dynamics depend on very fine spatial scale environmental heterogeneity properties. So we need to find ways of dealing with that and not just applying some large-scale average that we know is incorrect. Initialization is a big deal, which I'll get to. I think Peter alluded to that. The legacy of land use is important. There's about a 200 or 300 year time scale of recovery from land use changes, at least in forested ecosystems. So even if you're interested only in the future, unfortunately you have to worry about the past. And finally, falsification, which I think is a really important aspect of advancing these models. Thanks. Anyways, I just wanted to start with a couple of bullets on the importance of dynamic vegetation. Many people, including people in this group, have shown that the biological details of the land surface and GCMs improves paleoclimate and current climate predictions. It's only a partial list, so if I didn't cite you, I apologize. Biological feedbacks on climate are potentially large. That's been shown in numerous different kinds of systems and in global models as well. And a lot of those are biophysical, those feedbacks, albedo, rooting depth, so water cycle, energy balance factors. Others are carbon cycle feedbacks. Those are also shown to be large, and Peter just summarized that. Thanks, yeah. All right, so I want to summarize some challenges for these dynamic vegetation models and sort of my view of the status. First of all, there are these key lessons from Paleo Ecology, which are, if you're not an ecologist, are tempting to ignore. But whole communities don't remain intact and simply move as a unit as climate changes. It would be nice if they did, then we wouldn't have to have ecologists, but they don't. So Davis and her colleagues have shown this convincingly through paleo studies, fossil pollen mainly. Sorry, back up one. Second thing is that changes in vegetation sometimes lag behind the changes in climate. So it's not, the vegetation redistribution can't often keep up with climate changes. So there are these lags. Okay. So dynamic vegetation models need to address these properties. I'm going to summarize each of those. But you need to parameterize the growth of vegetation, and that's often in a species-specific manner ultimately. Mortality rates of vegetation, I'm going to talk about the importance of that. Most of the research in these models currently focuses on growth rates, whereas a big part of the story is actually in death rates, and you're going to see advances in that in the coming years. Disturbance is one big mode of mortality. Dispersal, the details of dispersal matter a lot, and I'll talk about that. Again, all of this for a set of species. There are studies that even show that biodiversity per se, separate from the sampling effect, that if you have more species, you have more species that can do different things. Separate from that phenomena, that biodiversity per se affects things like carbon cycle dynamics and ecosystem stability. Nutrient limitation is a huge one because I think most of these models overestimate actually the NPP response to CO2. So Peter thinks they're all right. I think they're all wrong. That leads into fertilization. Land use and land use history, hugely important, both for current effects on vegetation, but also, as I mentioned in my preview, there are these lagged effects of recovery from previous land use that can be 300 years or longer. And pollution, also important and a growing concern. And the list goes on and on. That's where I'm gonna cut it off. Thanks. So first of all, photosynthesis. You know, photosynthesis is most of the code in most of these models. And it's because it's a very complicated process that's been studied for a long time. It's cellular level process that actually occurs in a complex structure for most higher plants called leaves, which again are partitioned into different species. These leaves look very different on different species, giving rise to different growth rates at the species level. Those can be grouped into functional types that are very different, that actually do photosynthesis in fundamentally different ways, like C3, C4, CAM, for example. But so there's this scaling of photosynthesis from, you know, almost instantaneous photosynthetic fluxes, because it matters a lot if the sun is shining or not, if this process, for this process to occur, to global scales. So go ahead. Having said that, this is from the IPCC 2001 report. Most of these models are suggesting that there's a very strong CO2 effect on photosynthetic rates. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence from experiments that that is true, particularly when you elevate CO2 way above ambient. Commercial greenhouses grow with elevated CO2, for example. So it's a first order response, and you see this first order response in most of these models of a growing carbon sink due to CO2 only. That's the top left panel change. But if you advance the slide one more time, recent empirical result from John Casperson and myself, published in Science, analyzed forest inventory data for the United States, hundreds of thousands of forest plots, and basically falsified the idea that there's been any significant net growth rate change in plants in the United States, coterminous United States, that is. So CO2 fertilization may be a big deal if you double it or triple it or quadruple it on plant photosynthetic rates, but we're not seeing evidence of it now in big, large-scale empirical studies, raising some suspicion about whether we have it right in these projections forward.
Could be going to the soil, actually.
What's that?
Could be going to the soil.
Could be going into the soil, yeah. Yep.
There could be primary productivity increasing.
In this model, actually, the main, you know, so U.S. ecosystems are a net carbon sink of about 0.3 to 0.5 petagrams per year. In the 1980s, this study, and together with the Pacala study the year after, show that that's all due to recovery from prior land use history, and none of it is due to CO2 fertilization.
Well, that's not true everywhere.
Right.
US is always slightly different.
This is different. I'm going to show you some other ways in which it's different in this talk. All right. Yeah. So I would just interject that most of the dynamic vegetation models used to this point, AR3 at least, don't have any of that ecosystem recovery dynamic in it. Yet it's the major carbon sink mechanism in at least the US. All right, so I want to talk about disturbance for a second. Again, most models are focusing on growth. Maybe they're optimistic in that way or something, but death is kind of a morbid thing. But here's a very simple model, box model, if you will, of biomass of a forest. This first order differential equation here, dB dt, biomass is the biomass of vegetation in a forest, equals just the growth rate minus the mortality rate. That simple box model is actually could be thought of also as a the estimate of the mean dynamics of a spatial simulator where the mortality process was stochastic. But anyways, very simple model, and what it shows is that the equilibrium biomass of this system, time-dependent solutions on the second line, third line B star, that's the equilibrium biomass of this forest. That depends on both the growth rate of the vegetation and the mortality rate equally. So at least from that third line of that equation, you know that the mortality rate is as important as the growth rate, yet it gets only a few lines of code for every line of growth code. The last line is going to convince you that it's even more important than growth, because the time scale for this ecosystem to reach B star depends totally on the mortality rate. That's the last line there. So the time scale of ecosystem recovery depends totally on the mortality rate in that ecosystem, not the growth rate at all. Kind of counterintuitive. So we should retask all of our energy actually into improving our understanding of the mortality dynamics of plants. That's beginning. So we just held a workshop on this topic down in New Orleans, of all places. They had a lot of mortality recently. But bottom line is that not only are the AOGCM land models very naive in this area, but so are the terrestrial ecosystem models that are supposed to be sort of 1 or 2 steps ahead of the models that get into those AOGCMs. But disturbance can happen all the way from subtree to multi-tree to patch to landscape to regional scales. Yeah, sure.
Quick question on your last slide, but think about it for a second. Is that a model result, or is that something that's also physically consistent with our understanding of the descriptive nature of the processes you're studying? The mortality is more significant than growth.
So we can back up. That's about the simplest model of a forest that's possible. It has only a constant growth rate and a constant mortality rate. So it's a property of that model, but I think it's also a property of very advanced forest simulators, including the one I'm going to talk about in a minute. Yeah.
Structural question. What's the difference between a dynamic vegetation model and a terrestrial ecosystem model?
Oh, that's a good question. I'll show you a slide in a little bit. We have as many. We could give a different name to every different model. So models vary a lot in the different processes that they include. So ecosystem models, my use of that means that they typically do dynamic vegetation plus soil biogeochemistry, whereas forest simulators alone typically just do the above ground fraction.
In terms of the definition of DGVMs used, saying that the Kramer et al. Paper, it was just to do with the fact that those models tried to reproduce changes in land cover type, vegetation type, not just changes in structure. So you could have terrestrial ecosystem models, like forestry models, that tell me the forest, I'll tell you how big it is. But these models try to attempt to change the type of forest or change the grass.
Okay, so terrestrial ecosystem models don't change the type of vegetation. They're just talking about
Yeah.
just how it grows.
Some of them change the structure, like the leaf area or the height or the grain mass. Many will. But most won't change the vegetation type.
Yeah. There's no real clear and common usage of these different terms, so it's a good question.
Some of the dynamic global vegetation are not global.
Yeah, right.
This actually, we were talking about this earlier, and that there are these kind of two ways of looking at vegetation. One is that you can just grow it and die it in place and never change its distribution. I guess that would be more of an ecosystem model. Or you could actually have the climate moving vegetation around and growing in different places, which would be more dynamic vegetation model. Right?
But I would argue there are ecosystem models that do the latter process as well. So it's really, I don't think we have a clear nomenclature for these different classes of models. So it's a good question. Anyhow, they should do all of those processes, so we can focus on that.
I think early on there was a more distinct separation, and now they're merging.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, anyways, disturbance occurs on all these scales, and even the most advanced, models that are supposed to be predecessors to basically the land components of AOGCMs don't do this well. But all kinds of different drivers, many of which are climate dependent, from wind to lightning to drought to fire to flooding to landslides. So, of course, the land use terms impacts light levels, mortality, survivorship of plants, the structure of vegetation, the composition of the forest, the fate of the dead matter, et cetera, and ultimately feed back to affecting the mortality and growth rates of plants, the successional processes that occur in ecosystems, therefore the dynamic vegetation, if you will, and the biogeochemistry and biophysics. So something you'll see a lot more of probably by AR 5 or 6. So trees migrate, and I show this slide in it's a cover from a bioscience issue that we published a paper in. My students always love to, or their minds are blown when my general education students when I tell them that trees migrate. But how do they migrate? Well, they migrate through dispersal, so it's very different than animals. Next slide. But it turns out the details of this dispersal process matter a lot. And in subtle but significant ways. There's a paradox which this paper addresses in its opening called Reed's paradox of plant migration. And the paradox was that if you look at the paleo record for tree migrations in parts of Europe, that the observed migration rate of vegetation was inconsistent with models that tried to simulate that migration. In fact, it was faster than models could reproduce. When these models were parameterized with diffusion or simple normally distributed dispersal kernel kind of parameterization. It's called Reed's paradox of plant migration because we know the migration happened, but models weren't able to simulate it occurring as fast as it was observed to occur. So if you use an exponentially bounded dispersal kernel, that is, dispersal kernel is the probability of a seed rain as a function of distance from a parent plant. Turns out if that thing is exponentially bounded, like a lot of these smaller curves there, the resulting migration process will be a diffusion. And that will approach an asymptotic wave speed that unfortunately is too slow to explain some of these past migration events. But if the dispersal tails are leptokurtic, so they are fatter than exponentially bounded in the tails. Subtle, as you can see from that picture, empirically differentiating between those would be almost impossible. But the resulting dispersal process is qualitatively different. It's not a diffusion anymore. It's a patchy spread, as shown through these panels down here of a computer simulation of a patchy spread process. It's not just a single front, but there are seeds that get transported ahead of the main population and themselves start new expanding fronts. These models actually don't approach an asymptotic wave speed of migration and actually can have an arbitrarily fast wave speed. Another way of thinking of these is, how do oceanic islands get colonized by anything from plant-wise? Well, it's that rare dispersal event that blew. So this is just a computer simulation. I think it's kind of arbitrary scale, where we've normalized everything out just to illustrate the patchy spread.
So that's why animals carrying seeds.
Yeah.
Strong wind.
Right. So one of the quickest ways to get a non-exponentially bounded, you'd think that sort of the central limit theorem would make everything exponentially bounded. But one easy way to get a non-exponentially bounded dispersal kernel is when you have two different mechanisms of dispersal, because the sum of two normally distributed things is no longer exponentially bounded. So wind plus animal. And so some of the species that this is thought to help explain the best are species like that, beech, for example. Anyhow. Well, the mechanism of how you parameterize your vegetation distributions in the first place, in other words, the mechanisms explaining why you have different species in different regions, can potentially interact in bad ways with this dispersal problem to give rise to models that actually have species in the wrong place, in the right places for the wrong reasons, and that maybe amplify the pace of population dynamics following climate change. So here's a cartoon on the left of these ecological concepts of the fundamental and realized niche. So the niche is the range of environmental conditions in which a species can live. And we call that actually the fundamental niche. So the range of environmental conditions in which a species, in the absence of competition, could survive and reproduce. So these variables, think of those as environmental variables. And often it's more dimensional than just two. So those are sort of the tolerances to survival and reproduction. But the realized niche is the range of, in that same environmental variable space where you actually find the distribution of a species. And it's always, by definition, equal to or smaller than this fundamental niche. Well, if you were to sort of do a quick pass and sort of ignore that difference, just say I'm going to parameterize the distribution, the niche of species, the environmental tolerances of my species based on the current vegetation map, and I'm going to, not worry about dispersal, just assume everything can get everywhere, then you're going to get models with too fast of a response to climate change and not have the lags that I alluded to in my intro.
If the understanding of the fundamental is just wrong, the realized can be outside the box, right?
Sure.
Overlap.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. It would have to be wrong for that to occur.
Is the difference between the fundamental and realised to do with the history of the landscape? Or I don't understand why you can't, in principle, have it patchy across the whole envelope.
Well, so the point is that if that there are a class of models that have built these, some of the early dynamic vegetation models would actually parameterize the tolerances of vegetation based on overlaying maps of climate variables with maps of the current distribution of the vegetation. And that process is formally confusing these two different things. And it gives rise to some, obviously, problems for projections going forward.
I mean, there's got to be, like, soil is a limiting factor, right? Soil type and topography. So if you've got like a real rugged, steep terrain, climate may be conducive to certain things growing, but it can't grow because no soil.
Well, that could be a variable on here as well. So this could be an arbitrary variable. The main difference between these two is competition between plants. So in general, the observed range of a species will be less than its, potential range, just because it's outcompeted on the fringes of its range by superior competitors.
Models do that in one way or another.
Yeah, now we've progressed to a state where
But
we're trying to
saying earlier
predict this.
that you thought the timescales in models were too slow. This would imply they're too fast, right?
I'm saying that the models that confuse these two have too fast of a response.
But models that don't deal with the dispersal, the nature.
If they deal with the dispersal wrongly, they're going to be too slow. So we got to get in that middle zone.
The models at the moment are slow. And ghost dynamics doesn't make much difference on the
Yeah, I think we've gone from too fast to too slow, and we need to be somewhere in the
nice
middle.
for all that F1 dynamics to make a difference.
Yeah.
Sort it out, George.
I didn't say I was going to do all these things. All right. All right, fire. I do have to talk about fire. Because even this one, it's widely known, especially over the past couple of years, increasingly popular. Everybody's got to have fire all of a sudden. We know that 1% to 2% of the land surface burns every year. We know that from satellites. We know that it can cause rapid changes in ecosystem structure, carbon pools, even the range boundary of different vegetation types. But we don't know how fire, we're a long ways from understanding how this actually should be modeled. I want to give you a couple examples of that. So in some regions, this is an example from my work over the US, the human influence on fire activity is negative. There's actually been, we estimate, about a 2 order of magnitude reduction in burned area over the coterminous US because of the presence of humans. That's 2 orders of magnitude, all right? So here's a reconstruction of US fire history in burned area units. Our reconstruction in those bold sort of symbol curve, and independent reconstruction by Ski Houghton from Woods Hole Research Center on the bottom curve. It's all just a historical hearsay prior to that mark, and we hit USDA burned area data after that mark.
How large in 1700?
Yeah,
Is it 1% of the territory? Or 10%?
it's about 10% of the coterminous land area of the U.S. And the way you get that is about a third of the country burning on, this is the first order way you get that, a third of the country burning on a 3-year fire rotation interval. So that's about the grasslands of the Midwest. about a third of the country burning on about a 3-year fire frequency, roughly 10%.
And the grassland was burning also.
Grassland burning too, yeah. Yep. Yeah, mostly grassland. Yeah, mostly grassland. So
can you look at charcoal records to see if,
yeah,
and do you have any evidence for like
we,
that strong reduction by the end of the 19th century? That quick change.
so we've done simulation. I haven't done that. One could potentially do that. We have explored, you know, what if it wasn't here, but it was only half that in 1700. Not that sensitive anymore. Basically, the ecosystem recovery processes on grasslands have compensated for that. Anyhow, we do pick up USDA data here, and even since then, there's been a 1 order of magnitude reduction, so it's a big deal. We've already got our annual total for the U.S. this year. Right now, 20,000 square kilometers have burned already, and it's only July 31st, so we're looking like a big fire year this year. But 20,000 square kilometers is still down in the noise on this graph. This is 100,000 square kilometers right here. Anyways, if you propagate that through a terrestrial carbon model, which we did, what happens is this is a bunch of different models, but all simulating the consequences of this and land use history in the U.S. You get that the U.S. was a big source to the atmosphere for between 1700, 1800, and 1800 to 1900. And about that time, the derivative changed. And at about early 1900s, the U.S. ecosystem started to be a sink for carbon. And the reason is twofold. It's this massive reduction in burned area that occurred in the United States, and it's the abandonment of agriculture over forested ecosystems in the eastern half of the United States. Neither one of those mechanisms are in any are going to be ready for AR4, or hopefully some will be by AR5.
There's just different things that are burning now, right? I mean, now we're burning mainly pine forests in the west. Before we were burning grasslands in the Midwest.
Different things, sure, the fire pattern is changing. But you're also seeing, as a consequence of this, woody encroachment as being like the big deal over most of the western ecosystems. I mean, you can go see that your grassland is now a shrubland, or your shrubland is now a pine forest, or your pine forest is now a thick spruce forest. I mean, it's just moving all the vegetation classes up, and it has carbon cycle implications.
The implications in this region then that the fire frequency is completely ignition limited. Is that right? Essentially, that humans have an enormous impact by virtue of changing the ignition frequency.
Well, and I think I think we're really not doing a good job of changing the ignition frequency. I think we've actually subsequently been built models offline now of this suppression phenomena, and I don't think it's really the emission, a 2 order of magnitude reduction in emissions that's happened. I think what's happened is through satellite detection, aircraft detection, fragmentation of the landscape, road access, urban sprawl. Whenever a fire develops, we put it out that day or that week, rather than, so it's really a spread reduction. Yeah.
Well, and then the grasslands have been converted to agriculture, so that's a
Right, so they're offline right away.
I mean, there is some agricultural waste burning.
Yep. But tiny, yeah, small. All right, I want to advance off this in a second, but I just want to point out the punchline of this study actually, it wasn't really either of those things, but the fact that these two carbon sink mechanisms in the U.S., that is fire suppression and recovery from prior land use, have sort of a pessimistic future. Because eventually you can only, you'll reach some new limit of how much carbon storage can happen in an ecosystem, and eventually a recovery from prior land use will have completed itself, and you'll be at the climax of vegetation or whatever from before. So the carbon sink is projected to actually, in the most optimistic scenario, decrease to near zero by 2100 over the coterminous U.S., excluding any climate change or CO2 fertilization in the future. Again, we've argued those aren't important so far. So maybe they will come online and save save the U.S. carbon sink in the future, but you got to be pretty optimistic about that. There is a potential big downside, and that is that you, as you start storing carbon in these fire-prone ecosystems, carbon's obviously fuel for fire, and you're building risk. So can U.S. fire suppression efforts continue to be so successful? We simulated a complete failure of that process, like our satellites all go down in a solar windstorm or something like that. And, big time carbon source from all that accumulated woody vegetation on fire-prone ecosystems.
Is there fire suppression going on in the former Soviet Union, for example, or in Canada, where all these big?
Yeah, we haven't yet been able to expand this beyond the U.S. We do have a model now of this in the U.S., but I think it's going to be largely socioeconomically based. I mean, people, when they can afford it, like to control and exclude fire. You go through it. I'll show you the next slide. Actually, there's the reverse pattern, if you can do that. This is Brazil. We've also built a fire model for this area and propagated that forward. There, the influence of humans is the opposite. This is an ignition-limited area, and most of the fires are attributable to human activity right now. And when you look at projections of the future of Brazil through just development, that is road development, access to the forest, and sort of take simple models of fire ignitions that depend heavily on access to roads. We're projecting a doubling in burned area over the Amazon in just the next 20 or 30 years, not because of climate change, but just because of road access by people. So humans can have a suppressing or a igniting effect on fires.
Did you do reconstruction for?
No, no. We built the model and calibrated it off satellite data in the year 2000, and then sort of fit that one time point, but spatially over the whole domain, and then propagated it forward.
So you could get that with doubling the road, with building new roads, but what about roads plus climate change?
Didn't do that. Didn't do that.
Then there are other feedbacks in the system with insects, right? I mean, you see this in Colorado, the huge areas of forest are killed by pine beetles,
Yeah.
which are apparently related to climate.
Right.
Then that gives you another source of things you can burn a lot easier.
Yeah. And you see that a lot in the boreal fire systems too. Big disease outbreaks that can kill big tracts of forest, followed by
Not just boreal, but a large part of British Columbia is experiencing heavy fires because of insect outbreaks. It's a combination of fire suppression, logging suppression, insect outbreaks, changing seasonality. It's contributing to catastrophic fires which are not natural to the system.
Yeah. So I think the point of this, everybody's jumping on the bandwagon the last couple of years of including fire. That's good. But to think that you can just naively start with a wildfire model and be anything close to right over the U.S. or the Amazon is not accurate, because both systems are totally dominated by the human element. Yeah.
Well, and you have to be careful with some of these don't add. I mean, you mentioned the climate change and human in the Amazon. I mean, climate change is in the long term maybe insignificant, because if they're going to deforest it anyway, it may accelerate it a little bit, but if you're going to convert it to agriculture, it's going to be converted to agriculture, eventually. So that's going to be independent of climate unless the agriculture fails for some reason.
Sure, it depends how fast climate change is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it may change the rate, but what I said, in the long term, it would be irrelevant.
Yeah.
So if you lose it one way or the other.
Okay. Let's keep. This is all land use change. That's ready for. So this is one of my things that's ready for AR. What 5? Yeah. Land use change. In fact, the July issue we just published a global land use history reconstruction that's 1 by 1 degree gridded, 300 years, but it includes all the sub-grid scale land conversion rates that have occurred over that period.
Where is it? It's global?
Global change biology, global, yeah. So first thing, past 300 years, yeah. And we do scenarios there because obviously it's difficult to know all those rates uniquely. But the interesting thing about it, beyond being a driver for climate models, is that it includes processes not in other land use products, at least global ones. And one is shifting cultivation, and another is logging. There's a global logging reconstruction as part of this study. Those two processes together, important as they are by themselves, generate 70 to 90% of the secondary land area, that is recovering ecosystem land area. That's what I mean by secondary, recovering, worldwide. So if you just said, I'm going to put in, Ramincutti and Foley as my land use history, that's pretty good for cropland. In fact, we do the same thing. But you wouldn't have generated nearly enough secondary forest, recovering forest worldwide. And that's at a different successional status, different species types, different carbon balance, all those things you care about.
Do you provide estimates of uncertainties?
Not uncertain. Again, we do a scenario approach, and we don't know the probability of any of the different scenarios. So technically, it's not an uncertainty, but we do have a range. In fact, if you advance the next slide. Maybe advance the next slide. Or maybe I missed one. Okay, maybe it's maybe advance the next slide. Aha. Here are the wedges. So Ramincutti and Foley, for example, a lot of people use that. Here's cropland history through time to 2000. Here's this dotted line is pasture land area through time, according to the Hyde group out of the Netherlands. What these wedges are here, add those two together, you get about 30% of the land surface. So it's no longer a small fraction of the land surface. But what these gray boxes are here, this gray box here is our range of estimates of secondary land area produced by land use activities, and that is logging, or the abandonment of permanent agriculture, or shifting cultivation. We say that there's probably 10 to 40 million square kilometers of secondary land area worldwide. Our middle estimate's 20 million square kilometers. And just for carbon perspective, let's see, 10 million square kilometers growing at a net carbon rate of Harvard forest would be about a petagram net carbon sink. So this is more than enough to explain the terrestrial missing carbon sink. Whether I don't think it necessarily does explain all of it, but it is a big term. Let's back up a couple of slides. There you go. You also need, of course, nitrogen, because this affects dynamic vegetation, but also biogeochemistry. This is just to show, this is our work from our group, more than a doubling of nitrogen inputs to the land surface, pre-industrially to contemporary, more than a doubling.
Fertilizer?
Fertilizer and nitrogen deposition, primarily. So this obviously intersects with the question about nitrogen limitation of the carbon response to carbon dioxide question. Logging, of course, is a huge deal. It's a petagram in 1990. And you want to be careful of using our land use history product that's in global change biology, because if you just include a maps of secondary forest and think you've now included that phenomenon, so you're all set, you're going to get too big of a carbon sink worldwide. And that's because logging worldwide cuts down at least 70% of that. That is, we go back and re-log these recovering forests. These are managed forests. Virtually all forests in the U.S. fall into this category. They're recovering from having been cut before, and we're going to cut them again as soon as they're ready. All right. So let's advance. Succession. All this plays into this process of succession, which is another thing you're going to see some advances in AR5, I think. We have new capability of simulating succession. I want to point out, like I said before, at least 200-year timescales of biomass recovery due to succession. Species types, typically, even functional types, typically change during this process. You can go from evergreen to broadleaf, or broadleaf to evergreen, or deciduous to non-deciduous, or vice versa. So even from biophysical parameters are varying through succession. But this points out that succession also implies not just this box of carbon accumulating through time, but there's a biodiversity component. And this results from the ED model in Venezuela. And what we have here is time from 0 to 200 years on the x-axis, and above ground biomass on the y-axis. These dots are data from a chronosequence of nearby plots that are of known age. This middle curve is this ED model that includes 3 different tree functional types: an early successional, a middle successional, and a late successional. And these different plant functional types coexist through a niche partitioning where early successional plants are low wood density and grow very well in high light, and the late successional plants are high wood density and grow slowly in high light, but survive well in the shade. They coexist through this partitioning of the light environment. What this simulation shows is that if I were to, you need all 3 species present to give this middle black curve that approximately goes through this chronosequence of points here. Having just one of those species there would give you, if you had early successional only, you get a too fast of a carbon accumulation and it doesn't add up to enough. If you have the middle successional only, again, it's too fast, and then maybe it's good at the end. And if you have late successional only, it's too slow, but it's going to overestimate the total amount of carbon storage. So, which brings me up to my next slide, that dynamic vegetation is going to be increasingly about biodiversity. And beyond just a couple of functional types, this is just work to tip Dave Tillman and others, huge ecological program dedicated to understanding the effects of biodiversity on ecosystem functioning per se.
Are there models yet available that try to see how biodiversity could be changing in response, for example, to climate change?
No. Well, not global. There are local scale models. There are,
Envelope models as well, aren't they? Climate envelope models. Which are very different from this.
yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Sure.
Going back several slides, you had a 10% land surface in recovery. Is there a mean global vegetative recovery?
Is there a mean? So we estimate 10 to 40 million square kilometers with a middle estimate of like 20 million square kilometers. That's consistent with other estimates from FAO, for example.
But in terms of the timeline to achieve recovery.
Well, we also know the age. So the mean age of the forested fraction of that, about half of that's forested, by the way, we estimate. The mean age is very important because if it's young, then it's going to be a net carbon sink, and if it's old, it's going to be, being a small net carbon term probably. We estimate the mean age to be about 40 years, which is consistent with the forest inventory in the United States. At least our estimates over the United States are consistent there. But we actually don't have good independent verification of those numbers yet.
I'll just make a quick comment about this, George. The important thing about this is that the top one is species diversity, right? And it says that biomass saturates at 30 or something species, which would be a disaster. We can never do it in a GCM. But the lower one says that if you get the functional groups right, you only need 4 or 5,
Right.
which means we can do it.
Well, but these functional groups are not the same as you're used to. So this is not just, one evergreen, one deciduous, one
No,
C3, one C4.
So
these are all different functional types of grasses occurring in this one grassland ecosystem. And in fact, this study has gone on to show that when you look at resilience or stability in the face of environmental changes, that number expands. So this study was then hit by a drought, and it turns out they needed, even more functional groups to stabilize the response from the drought. So,
okay, but maybe we can talk about that later.
Yeah.
There's 2 ways to go about dealing with that.
Sure, at least.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to have to race through this, but I'm going to show you just briefly like the beginnings of what we're doing to try to address some of this. Not all of it, though. Never committed to that. So if you could advance that. So we mentioned that there's traditionally, these are models prior to AOGCM models, but there's lots of different kinds of ecological models that are used to address the questions that I've been talking about, from highly aggregated, what I call highly aggregated classical terrestrial ecosystem models. In fact, that top figure is from Kick's model, the terrestrial ecosystem model, where the state variables, carbon and vegetation. That's the state variable. And carbon and soil, and nitrogen and vegetation, and nitrogen and soil. There's also these land surface models, like maybe the early ones that were in GCM, SIB. That's a picture of the SIB model. Just energy exchange mainly. They've since bolted simple carbon parameterizations onto that. And then you have this group of forest simulators, illustrated by that bottom curve, 4A Jabois, huge group of ecological research actually simulating the composition of forest communities on a tree-by-tree scale. The different colors are different species. You can see they're different sizes, et cetera, et cetera. So recently what we've done is develop the capability. These models have been great for vegetation dynamics locally. Problem is how are you going to run that globally? Right? Tracking every tree globally. So that's another thing that's ready for AR4 and even more so AR5 is new scaling technologies that allow us to do that. Include the biological detail of a forest simulator, but at global scales. So
You're saying that's a challenge, but not that you know how to do it.
I know how to do it. That's another one that I know how to do. It's two things I know how to do. That's land use history and scaling forest dynamics.
Okay.
The rest of it,
So you just aggregate things. That was there was a word up there. And you can't obviously model every tree, so you have to somehow just statistically.
we do it statistically, so I'll show you
It's
that.
like a cloud problem. That's all.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Can we claim we can do it with the clouds?
Get that solved.
yeah. Yeah, so it's a statistical mechanics type approach. So, I call this biological scaling. There's a lot of models that take plant physiology and maybe ecosystem biogeochemistry and collectively call that ecosystem physiology and go straight into making these regional or global calculations of carbon fluxes and maybe biophysical properties as well. But what we're trying to do, and this is the recent progress, are models that can represent all the effect of that on individual vital rates, disturbance and land use change, stand level, carbon structure and fluxes, to produce the same kind of estimates at the end, but having resolved all the vegetation dynamics in between. So you can advance that, thanks. Yeah. So I'm just gonna, sorry. It's a Mac thing. Anyways, I'm going to go quickly through this because the biology in this is the same as the biology that the community is well aware of. This is leaf level physiology that's based on the Farquhar, Ballenberry still model control of photosynthetic rates, where leaves at the cellular level on leaves, plants are trying to capture carbon, but also not overheat and lose water. So there's 5 equations it turns out that they have to simultaneously solve in order to try to do that. This model actually uses empirically observed allometric properties of plants. So we don't predict the allometry of plants. The allometry of plants is the dimensions of plants, like how tall are they, how fat are they, whether they look like a bush or a tree. So we, rather than mechanistically predict that, actually take the measured allometry of plants and invert it to figure out how plants allocate. If they're given size and they gain some more carbon, we say they grow to look like the next bigger plant in the data-defined allometry. Now that's a problem. We're going to have to fix that by AR60 because plants are obviously making dynamical decisions about how they're going to allocate resources that we don't have yet. Biodiversity. We do biodiversity in the end with this model in a functional type approach, but we're working on species level approaches actually of the same implementation. We're limited only by the data. But the functional types used in this model are based on Peter Reich's work on the global convergence of plant functioning. These data illustrate, so I should have a citation to Peter Reich down here. But these are leaf level properties of vegetation worldwide. Each one of those points is the properties of leaves from a stand. And you can see that a lot of the properties scale with leaf lifespan, and there's trade-offs with specific leaf area and leaf nitrogen content. So, for example, a broad leaf plant is typically, that has a very high specific leaf area, it's typically going to have a very short leaf lifespan. So if you look at the US trees, for example, maple tree or something, they have a leaf lifespan of 5 or 6 months, broad leaf. Compare that with an evergreen tree that has a needle, very low specific leaf area, but they keep them for 10 years. So plants, Peter Rice calls it the global convergence of plant functioning, and says that these are sort of the fundamental trade-offs in leaf properties, and that underlies the biodiversity in this model. In addition, C3, C4, CAM, photosynthesis. Yeah. But this is all just example, because what I really want to talk about is the scaling. So if you could advance. I talked a lot about mortality in my intro.
Sorry, but I know what C3 and C4 plants are, but I don't know what CAM is. So.
Isolation acid metabolism.
There you go. Cactuses mainly do this.
Okay, but
Succulents.
Yeah.
And they just switch their daytime and nighttime activity. So in other words, they've got their stomata open at night.
All right, I know I'm getting short on time, but the mortality in here is just carbon balance related. That's what the graph on the left shows. We calculate for every tree all the time the carbon balance. That is a ratio of how much carbon it's gaining through photosynthesis versus how much it's losing through respiration, autotrophic respiration. And if you're in negative carbon balance, your rate of mortality goes up dramatically, and we can show that through field data that that's true. You can advance that. And we have disturbance of two types. This is very crude. Tree fall level disturbance rate. This is a common parameter in forest gap models. Just some fraction of the landscape is disturbed by an external force every year. The implied mechanisms are wind throw or lightning damage, but very few models simulate the climate dependence of those processes, and that's another thing you're going to see by AR or whatever. And of course, fire mortality. Okay, so scaling. This is general. We've shown this works for a large set, actually, of forest community models that differ in biological detail. So it's not a biological detail dependent scaling method. But what it results in, it starts with a description of a forest community as a stochastic simulator that all the environmental conditions are local. And in particular, the light environment, the most varying, spatially varying, small scales property of many forests.
So it's actually having sun sticks on a plot.
Yeah. So in other words, it's important to know to a forest community if a patch of ground is sitting in full sun or it's in the shade. Total difference to the plant dynamics in those two patches. And we do some statistical mechanics to that and derive an expectation to the mean dynamics of that stochastic process. That expectation of the mean is a set of differential equations, much like occur in physics. Those two equations, one describes the fraction of the landscape in different age classes since a disturbance event hit. The other equation describes what's in patches of that age. And as you can see, this bottom equation is the fraction of the landscape in different age classes. We're keeping track of the age as well. You can age, or you can be hit by disturbance. Those are the two loss rates. And in terms of what's in a patch of that age, you can grow out of, we also keep track of the size class of the trees. So you can grow out of the size class or into it. You can die in one of these disturbance events, or you can just age. And of course you need boundary conditions to close this system. I know I'm really out of time. Point is, the approximation matches the simulator. That's the curve on the left. Each green curve is a stochastic simulator over about a 1 square kilometer domain. The red is the differential equations. Runs much faster. We get the mean directly. Done. Using simpler approximations doesn't work. There you see a poor approximation not reproducing the mean of those simulations.
Does your approximation just keep track of the mean, or also the variability?
Right now we just keep track of the mean. Good question.
Yeah, one thing you notice about that graph, though, is that envelope is growing.
Yeah. So that envelope
so you
is...
have to include that effect as well in your simulation.
Well, in reality, that envelope is spatial scale dependent. So if we had an infinite domain, which we obviously don't, but just to give you a perspective, there'd be no variance at all between those simulations. All the stochasticity is coming from the finiteness of the domain. So it's totally scale dependent how much variance there is. So in other words, about the smallest spatial scale you can implement this approximation on without having very large variance is about a hectare. Because there you've got on the order of 10,000 trees, which is a pretty good sample size. Anyhow, keep advancing. I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to rush through this. We know why the simulator works, so keep advancing. And we can make all these predictions of both eddy flux tower kinds of fluxes and forest structural dynamics, etc. Parameters for climate models. This is for the Amazon. I know I'm racing now. But we've actually used all this technology to build a new land model for Earth system studies. And we ran it through a set of experimental design like this, where we had land use history or didn't have land use history. We had CO2 increase or didn't have CO2 increase. We have all combinations of these things. We're recycling a 30-year climate or over and over again from 1951 to 1970, or we're actually including recent climate change. And you can advance this. I want to just point out advance it again. I want to just point out some things that we don't know. This model is a lower panel, shows no land use case using true climate data. Red curve is showing difference between the red curve and the black curve is how much CO2 fertilization we have. And it's about 2 gigatons per year, like a lot of other models. We think it's wrong. Like a lot of other models. You can see that ENSO matters, and I'm just going to advance that. I know I'm out of time. We can attribute here's our zonal distribution of carbon fluxes. We can attribute that to land use or climate in different zones. Keep on going, because I keep saying I'm out of time. Keep going. And we can look for spatial diagnostics of things that are happening. You know, without including land use, we get a pretty weak carbon sink in eastern forests of the U.S. where we know there's a strong one. So if you advance that, including land use, you know, we don't get a weaker sink, we get a stronger sink because it's all land use history creating the carbon sink in U.S. ecosystems. Now that area is bright red, indicating strong carbon sink. Go ahead. Whereas in the Amazon, it's the reverse. Not including land use, we get too much carbon sink in the Amazon. Including land use, deforestation dominates this regrowth process, and it's more of a carbon sink. And you can also estimate the effects of recent climate change on drying. Go ahead. Okay, so finally conclusions, and just go ahead and advance all the way to the end. I had these 5 themes that were cross-cutting this talk, and here's my sort of take-home messages from that. Mechanism. Models need to continue to focus on the mechanisms governing the distribution and abundance of species, and I think we're on the verge of big advances for that through these, basically the second bullet that allows us to do the biological scaling from small environmental heterogeneity, small spatial scale environmental heterogeneity to large domains. We need improvements in falsification. So I think we're at this optimistic time where you're going to see more and more of these models using data from all kinds of different sources, from the forest inventory, from eddy flux towers, from CO2 inversions, all collectively together to try to falsify different models. Initialization is a big deal because of the legacy of land use history mainly and disturbance history. More generally. So I think there's a big model initialization challenge. And you can do that one of 2 routes. You can either simulate all land use history and natural disturbance history, maybe using the product that I just released, or you can try to measure the structural properties of ecosystems directly. And there's some new satellites that promise that, ISAT being the promising at the moment. The satellite designed to measure the thickness of ice sheets also happens to measure the height of trees over land. And you can imagine the height of trees is related to their age, and so that's a promising approach. And finally, forcing, which is something that Peter mentioned. The progress in the end depends on both improving the Earth system models, but also the scenarios, which are going to be driving these things. So it's raining, so I'm done.